It is time for another episode of the Cultural Hall, and glad to welcome back here to the Cultural Hall, McKay Coppins. If you did not listen to episode 384, that is where we get to know all about McKay Coppins, who he is. You'll probably get a little sprinkling about who he is as we chat today, but that's not this interview. This interview is all about his latest book, Romney, A Reckoning. And I wish that I had like an echo as we go through this. Thank you for being here, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, so we are in a limited amount of time, so I'm getting straight to the point. What advantages are gained, and what are the disadvantages on having a book about Mitt Romney written by another member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
It's a good question. It's funny because I've been covering Mitt Romney for a long time, and I first covered him during his 2012 presidential campaign, and I was the only member of his faith on the campaign press bus. Like among the traveling reporters from national outlets who followed him around the country, I was the only Mormon. The other reporters would call me the Mormon Wikipedia because they would like ask me, questions for the stories they were filing or whatever. But what's weird is that in 2012, in some ways, it was actually a disadvantage that I shared his faith because Mitt Romney's political consultants had kind of decided as a matter of campaign strategy not to talk about his faith, or at least to talk about it as little as possible.
Mhm.
And I was like the annoying reporter who was constantly writing inconvenient stories about how his religion had shaped him because I could tell that it had. But because of that, they never gave me access to him in 2012. Like I never interviewed him.
Hmm.
And so I didn't actually interview him one-on-one until he got to the Senate in 2019. And at that point, he was kind of in a different stage of his career. He wasn't trying to be president. And he was, I think, a little bit more in a mode of like being himself, being true to himself. So anyway, he talked to me when I pitched him on doing this book. He actually told me, and it was kind of funny given our history, I think it's an advantage that you get the Mormon thing. And I didn't totally know what he meant at the time, except that, the obvious, like, yeah, I understand kind of the context in which he grew up and some of his beliefs and value system. But it also ended up being true that I understood him in a certain way that I don't know if even other Latter-day Saints who had grown up, for example, in Utah would have. So both he and I grew up members of the church in places where there weren't a lot of members. He grew up in Michigan. I grew up in Massachusetts. And he said to me at one point that, growing up in our faith outside of a place like Utah, you get used to being different in ways that are important to you. And I thought that was kind of a profound insight because that has sort of been the theme of his political career over the last several years. Like
Mhm.
he has been the sort of like lonely Republican in the Senate caucus lunches that nobody wants to sit with or talk to. And he's been often the only Republican voting to impeach Trump or speaking out against, what he considers the excesses of his party. And he has been different than a lot of his fellow Republicans, but it's in ways that he felt were important. And I think he drew from his experience growing up a member of the faith, of our faith in a place like Michigan. And I think that I innately understood that in a way because had both had that experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Would you think that there are any disadvantage, maybe a little bit harder for you to pinpoint if there's any sort of disadvantages with you writing it as opposed to maybe someone that had no idea about the faith?
I mean, one obvious disadvantage is that, and because I've been writing about our faith for national publications for a long time, I feel like I've gotten pretty good at explaining things in a way that's accessible to non-members. But it's still, there were things that like my editor, who's not, a Latter-day Saint, would come across in the book and be like, so wait, what's going on? So I remember one of the first things was he had the hardest time, even after several versions of trying to rewrite it in a way that made sense. My editor had the hardest time understanding like the mechanics of a Mormon mission. Like I
Hmm.
wrote about Mitt Romney's mission to France, and I think because other faiths, when they talk about missions, they're usually like 2-week missions or 3-month missions at
Sure.
most, right? Like he had a really hard time understanding, like, so hang on, so he took 2.5 years off college to do this. Like, I really don't think that's clear. And so, there were a few different times like that where I had to kind of check my own knowledge of his, faith experience, and then try to kind of iron it out and make it presentable and accessible to a non-Mormon audience. So that probably, if there was a disadvantage, that might have been it.
You know, as I would say read, but I listen to books. I'm sorry that I don't
Sure.
read them. I'm making that public apology. It is much easier for me to
Are you
go,
apologizing to me? You don't have to
yes,
apologize. As
no,
long as you bought the audiobook, I'm happy.
yeah, there's something I think that some people would say about sitting peacefully with a written word and all that, and I'm like,
Sure, sure.
on the treadmill in my ear, let's do it this way, those kind of things. But listening to it, there is a lot of reckoning. I mean, to use the title of the book, is there one particular reckoning that was in mind when titling the book, or is it just because there is so much reckoning of, like, Mitt and his faith, him and his father, him and his family? Like,
Mhm.
there's so much of that. Was there one in particular?
Not really. I mean, I think it has more to do with his general the general approach he took to, talking to me throughout the process of working on this book. I mean, when I approached him about writing his biography, it was uh, actually early 2021, and we were a few weeks removed from kind of a very contentious presidential campaign that ended in, a riot at the U.S. Capitol that Mitt Romney actually was there for. And he was going through kind of a process that I could just tell from the outside, having gotten to know him and, written about him. I could tell he was going through something. Like, he was asking himself difficult questions about what was happening to the country, whether he had kind of misunderstood what his party was all about. A lot of the people who were cheering on what happened on January 6th were people who had not long ago been his supporters when he
Mhm.
ran for president. And so I think he was just asking himself a lot of difficult questions. And as a biographer, that's like the best place that your subject can be in, because they're introspective, they're soul searching, they're willing to be vulnerable. And so the reckoning, I think, has to do with a few different things. Like you said, it has to do with him taking stock of his own career, where he may have made mistakes, regrets he had, where he felt like maybe he had compromised or rationalized. That's one of the main themes of the book. And then there's also a reckoning about kind of the state of American democracy. Like, he's very concerned about um, the fragility of the American project. I write at the beginning of the book about this map that he has on the wall of his Senate office, that it's called the Histo map, and it charts the rise and fall of the most powerful civilizations throughout human history. So you have, like, the Greeks and the Romans and the Assyrians and the Egyptians, um, and he had, when he first hung that on his wall, it was 2019 when he first got to the Senate, and he kind of thought of it as like an interesting thing to show visitors. And after January 6th, he kind of became obsessed with it. And I remember when he showed it to me in one of our first interviews, he was like, look at this map, look at all of human history, look at how rare it is for democracy to be thriving, right? Almost all of the most powerful civilizations in human history are like authoritarian regimes of some kind. You have emperors and kings and kaisers and people who rule over their subjects with an iron fist. And the what he told me was the American experiment in self-rule, where we choose our leaders and they're accountable to us, is actually like an anomaly in human history. And we have all taken it for granted as, like, of course, this is the best form of government and it's going to last forever.
Mhm.
But his takeaway from the last several years of politics is uh, that American democracy is much more fragile than we realize, and if we want to preserve it, we have to fight for it. And so that, I think, is the other main reckoning going on in the book.
When I've heard in other interviews where you talk about how you come to him with this project and you're like, but I'm not going to pull any punches. And he's like, in his Romney ways, like, I insist on it. And then it almost becomes I dare you, you betcha. And then if I understand right in how you've spoken about it, the book could almost be like Wednesdays with Mitt, right? Where you guys sit down, you get
Yeah.
together once a week, and he's like, you know what the problem is, and that's what it is sometimes, and other times it's like, oh, let's go back to where we were and talk about how I felt in that time. How is that interchange, that exchange you've been following for so long, and now you get complete unfettered access to him and all his writings?
Yeah, I mean, that last part was like the most jarring thing for me because, like, think of a public figure that you're just extremely interested in, right? Like, a celebrity, athlete, whoever that you followed for a decade plus. Um, like, you naturally always wonder, like, what are they really thinking? Like, what
Mhm.
was this moment like? What, you know, when this famous thing happened and they kind of gave their very like brief talking pointy statement and then like retreated, like what was really going on behind the scenes, all of a sudden I had access to all of that. Like,
Mhm.
because one of the very first things he did was hand over all of his journals, which, he's been through periods of his life where he kept very detailed journals. And his presidential campaign in 2012 was one of them. And it was so interesting for me to have been a reporter on that campaign and written stories from the outside, just being in the kind of press area at his rallies and on the back of the bus, to now be reading like these very intimate journals where he would vent about the frustrations of the day or really take himself to task for some gaffe that he had committed, or think through, who should my running mate be, do I have to fire my consultants, like, all these like really unfiltered thoughts that he was just putting into his journal every day, the dynamics between him and his wife and him and his kids, like it was kind of almost startling, but also so interesting to me to have access to all of that. And it's funny. The first I probably like shouldn't confess this in on your podcast in particular, but when he first sent me the first like kind of chunk of his journals, I was actually at church. It was on a Sunday, and
Yeah.
he just texted me and he was like, "Hey, McKay, before our next meeting, this might be interesting for you to review." And I like looked at it and it was like all of his personal journals, and the first entry was the first entry he wrote after losing the 2012 presidential election,
Oh,
where he
wow.
was like processing his feelings about it. And I like will admit to you and your audience that I did not pay very close attention to Sunday school that day. Like, I immediately was just reading it on my phone and was like completely absorbed. Like, and so I mean, that part of it was really strange, but also felt like such a privilege because Mitt Romney, especially, but this is true of a lot of politicians and political figures, like, he was just very guarded throughout his whole political career. So to finally kind of see behind the scenes was really fascinating. And I wanted the book to have that intimate feeling for readers, to feel like they were going behind the scenes. Like, there's been a lot of stuff in the press about like the juicy revelations and the things that he said about various Republicans. But like, I think that actually reading the book is a different experience because there's a lot that hasn't been covered in the press. That's just, if you're interested in Mitt Romney, I think you'll be interested in what he had to say during these periods.
A thing that has particularly struck me as I've been listening, to know that he has a temper. Here, I think that this is a very polished, and
Mhm.
we maybe have seen a little bit of these things in the more recent past, where you see him sort of say something to the Republican, where he says you shouldn't be here or something like
Oh
that.
yeah, George
Yeah,
Santos.
George
Yeah,
Santos and some of these other things where he's just not been able to contain it. But to know that that's something that he has struggled with,
yeah.
I didn't have any idea, and it was fun to hear of those encounters.
He's really good at kind of hiding it publicly, right? Like, you don't get the sense that he's somebody who has a temper, but it's funny because people around him that I interviewed for this book like would all have different like angry Mitt stories, and
Yeah.
like one of them was when he was running for governor of Massachusetts. He was doing they had to do these mock debates where they would kind of do practice debates with his advisors to prepare for the real thing against his Democratic opponent. And he hated mock debates. Like he hated them so much because what it is basically is you stand up, there's somebody at the other podium playing your opponent. In this case, it was Beth Myers, his longtime advisor. And her job is to try to rattle him, right?
Yeah.
Her job is to like get under her skin, get under his skin, like get fluster him so that when the real debate happens, he doesn't get flustered. And so what she said her strategy was is that she like spent a lot of time studying his Democratic opponent's talking points so that she knew what talking points to use when a question would come up. But then she would end every answer by just saying something mean about him.
Yeah.
Like just kind of like needling him in some way. And he got so mad every time. And at one point, he actually threw his notes on the floor. And he said, if this is what it's going to be like, I might as well not even show up because I'm going to lose this election.
Yeah.
And he just got like really angry. And then he would like calm down and kind of like, you know, gather his notes and like go back to work. Right. And he is somebody who I think like he can get heated up and angry, but then he cools down quickly too, and he'll apologize. Like you know, even he and I like had a couple contentious you know, conversations where he would like send a text after kind of being like, I'm sorry if that got a little too heated. And I mean, I will say as somebody who covered politicians for a long time, like the people get a lot more heated than him and use much more like foul language than he does. Like the Mitt Romney version of losing your temper is different than a lot of other politicians. But he has this temper, and but he's tried to control it. And I write in the book that he's kind of like his persona is like this amalgam of Mormon niceness and prep school manners and like the kind of practiced cool of the private equity set. Like
Yeah.
it's kind of every world that he's been in prioritizes like controlling your temper, not showing too much emotion. And that's why his public persona has been defined by that. But it's also why like seeing the temper behind the scenes or getting accounts of it, I think are also revealing.
You know, one of the things that also sort of permeates throughout the book is not like he's trying to make amends for his father not winning, but that like he has to prove the Romney name. It seems very
Yeah.
much that there is a Romney means that you are a this, and a Romney
Yeah.
means
Oh,
that you are a
definitely.
this. Tell me a little bit more about that and some of the things that you learned what a Romney is and what a Romney isn't.
Yeah. So he, first of all, I should say, like, idolizes his dad. His dad, George Romney, governor of Michigan, an auto executive in Detroit in the 1950s and 60s. He ended up running for president, and he was kind of a liberal Republican. He was a proponent of civil rights. And he got crushed in part because of like a gaffe he had committed about Vietnam. But he his dad to Mitt is like the embodiment of integrity in public service. Like he thought his dad would have been a great president, was like a profoundly, you know, moral man. And the fact that he didn't become president, I think, was one of the great disappointments of not just George Romney's life, but Mitt's life. And so, in a lot of ways, Mitt's own political career was, you know, again, not, I don't think it was trying to fulfill his father's unfinished legacy necessarily, but I think there might have been shades of that, right? But yeah, I mean, the way he talks about the Romney family, uh, there are a couple things. Like one of them is stubbornness. Stubbornness is like a running theme of the Romney family history. There's a saying in the family that that we didn't descend. The Romneys aren't like normal people. We descended from the mule. And there's another one about Romneys kind of swimming upstream. They swim against the tide. It says if you know, if a Romney drowns, look for his body upstream. And there's like all these stories throughout his family history about um, various Romney men kind of doubling down on what they thought was right in the face of like enormous pressure not to. George Romney is one example. He in 1964 at the Republican National Convention refused to endorse Barry Goldwater, who was the nominee of the party at that time, because he thought that he was an extremist, and he got booed by the audience and all that. But you can even go all the way back to Miles Romney, who was the first Romney man to convert to Mormonism. He was a British carpenter, I believe, moved to Utah, went to work for the church. And there's this story about how he was an architect, carpenter. He was assigned to design the St. George Tabernacle, and he designed. He had this idea for like this grand spiral staircase at the center of the tabernacle that would lead up to the dais where the speakers would speak from. And Brigham Young came and saw what he was doing, and he was like, "That's going to be too high. The dais is going to be too far away from the rest of the people in the tabernacle. You need to cut this down." And Miles Romney just refused. Like he was like, "No, this, he had this vision for the grand spiral staircase, and he said no." And Brigham Young insisted, and they were kind of like came head to head. And if you look at the St. George Tabernacle now, you still have the grand staircase, and then it comes down 10 feet. Like it goes up and then down, so that the dais is where Brigham Young wanted, but they didn't lose the staircase. And it kind of speaks to like the stubbornness of a Romney man who thinks that he's right about something. And I think that Mitt did take a lot of these lessons from his family history and apply them to his own life. The other one I should mention really quickly is something he calls the Romney obligation. Mitt believes that like throughout his family's history, there's this like almost genetic disposition to want to rush toward a crisis. Like when something is going wrong, you should be there to fix it. Like the Romneys feel this need to go, solve the problem. And Mitt certainly has fallen back to that multiple times throughout his life when he decided to go take over the Salt Lake Olympics when they were in trouble. When he ran for governor of Massachusetts, the state was in a fiscal crisis, and he took over the state at that point. And he's always kind of felt this need to, go toward the emergency and try to fix it. And part of it is noble. It's this kind of public spirited sense of obligation, but it's also, and he talked about this, he gets an adrenaline rush from it. Like
Sure.
he likes to be in the center of of what's going on in the middle of the action. And I think that's part of why when Donald Trump was elected and Washington became like extremely divisive and contentious and chaotic, he decided to come out of retirement and run for Senate because he saw a crisis that he could possibly help with.
So much of what it seems like he finds himself in as well is at the urging of his wife. They have a unique
Mhm.
relationship in that respect. One in that he almost trusts her more than he trusts himself. And it almost is like sickeningly sweet, where he dotes on her, and oh, and whatever she says, the smarter the woman. D- is it really all that, as in your observation of visiting with him?
It is totally real. It's funny because I had seen the version of their marriage that was portrayed on the campaign trail in 2012. And what's funny is that throughout Romney's political career, the way they portrayed their marriage actually sometimes was a problem for him because voters would look at it and feel like it was phony, like it
Yeah.
was inauthentic, like they were skeptical of it. There was an ad that his campaign ran in when he was running for governor of Massachusetts, where Mitt and Ann tell the story of their teenage courtship. They were high school sweethearts, and there's kind of this cloying twinkling piano music in the background, and there's like it's intercut with like pictures of them as kids, and voters hated it. It was so bad that there was like data that showed that when voters watched the ad, they actually liked Mitt Romney less, which is not what you want from a campaign ad. But it's because people thought it was sort of phony and plastic. And the irony is that that's really what they're like together. Like he has so much affection for Anne, but also in some ways, like it seems like he's never stopped trying to win her approval and respect. And at almost every important stage of his career, Anne was the one steering him in any given direction. So it was Anne's idea for him to take over the Olympics in Salt Lake City. Anne wanted him to run for governor of Massachusetts. Um, she was there at various points during both of his presidential campaigns. And even just a few years ago, when Mitt Romney was weighing which way to vote on the impeachment trial for Donald Trump. Um, at one point, Romney was kind of leaning more toward voting to acquit with the rest of the Republicans, kind of letting Trump off the hook. And when he called Anne to let her know that that's which way he was leaning, Anne, all she said was, "I'm surprised by that."
Hmm.
And she didn't render any judgment. She didn't like, argue with him or anything. But in his journal, he immediately wrote like, "Oh man, I got to go back to the drawing board. Like I got to reconsider this. Like Anne doesn't seem happy with this or doesn't think that this is right. So now I have to rethink everything." And so it really speaks to how much he respects her and her take on things. And I mean, I should say I also have seen them together and interviewed them together several times throughout the course of this book, and they really do have like it's a sweet relationship, but it's also like a very like a serious one that seems built on mutual respect. Like he often defers to her. He doesn't do that thing that you sometimes see powerful men do where they like cut off their wives or correct them. Like he
Hmm.
never does that. Like
Hmm.
he really like listens to her, lets her have her full say, even in settings where people are more there to see him. Like it's a real serious partnership.
It's a fascinating thing when you consider Mitt Romney within, I live here in the state of Utah, so I probably even see this more where, um, he seems to be a man of principles, one that he does the things that he feels like he should or that are best, and then doesn't do those things that he does, that he doesn't feel like he should. He tries to be true to who he is and what he feels like constituents want. And there are a lot of people in this state who hate him, think that he's just, he's a, Republican in name only, and that he had to come to Utah to be this thing. And it seems so fascinating. So maybe from the inside of the church, it seems so fascinating to have so much hatred for an individual whom we align, air quotes, so much with in some ways, but then when we actually see them do the things that we want them to do or that we think a politician should do, if it's not the thing that we wanted them to do, we immediately
Yeah.
shun them.
Yeah, it's funny because this is one of the things that I wanted to show in this book, because I think you can disagree with a lot of things Mitt Romney has done or positions he's taken in good faith. Like I think reasonable people can disagree on both the kind of very conservative positions he took earlier in his career or the this latest kind of chapter of his career where he's repeatedly stood up as like a dissident in the Trump's Republican Party. I think you can disagree reasonably, but I think that there's this line of criticism against him, especially from more conservative Republicans in Utah and elsewhere, that he doesn't, that he's in all of this for himself, right? That like he's either vindictive and he doesn't like Donald Trump, and that's why he's acting the way he is, or he just wants praise from the New York Times and the Atlantic and MSNBC, and he's just kind of enjoying the mainstream media praise, and that's it. And like I can tell you with certainty from reading his journals throughout the last several years, reading his email correspondence, interviewing him more than 40 times over 2 years, that like he takes his role as a senator and as a political figure very seriously. And he takes these decisions he makes very seriously. And he often agonizes over them. He prays about them. He like steeps himself in scripture. He's like thinking about hymns. He's, consulting the people in his life. Like he really wants to make the right decision. And it's not just to make friends in liberal Washington. And it's not just to, secure his place in the history books or whatever. Like he is honestly, especially in these last few years, his only consideration for the most part has been what he thinks is the right thing to do. And you can disagree that he came with the conclusions he came to, but I hope that people who read this book will see that he is going about this in a pretty deliberative way. And the reason that I hope that I think that's important is not because I think it's personally important that everybody likes Mitt Romney. Like that's,
Sure.
that's not really why I wrote this book. It's more that I think that we should expect our political leaders to do what he is doing more often. Like, I think we have all internalized this idea in the last 7 or 8 years, especially, that like all politicians are snakes and all of them are just acting in their own self-interest and they're Machiavellian and, maybe even sociopathic. And, all we should do is, expect them to act in their own self-interest and vote for the ones who we agree with most, right? And I just think that's fundamentally wrong. Like, I think that actually most politicians went into office with a set of ideals and principles and functioning consciences. And we should expect political leaders sometimes to do what they think is right, even when it's politically inexpedient. Like, even when it might mean the end of their political career. Like in the case of Mitt Romney, I think that we should expect them to act on their conscience. And that lesson only comes through if you believe that that political leaders actually do have a conscience. And I think what you see if you read this book is a man who is genuinely wrestling with his conscience often throughout his political career, and I think that's a good thing.
It's also interesting because you see him equated. I can't remember where it was, but to Guy Smiley from Sesame Street, the puppet that always has this smile on his face and everything like that, and never utters an ill word. But the book, his journals, your writings do bring up for a lot of people the Romney side of the Romney Huntsman everything,
Oh, yeah.
and you just are like, oh. For everything that was downplayed, like, oh man, that's not a thing. It is so very much a thing for Mitt
Yeah.
Romney.
The Romney Huntsman rivalry is real. It's a family rivalry, so it's not just about Mitt and John Jr. But Mitt and John Jr., I think it's fair to say, do not, especially like each other. It goes. I write about it repeatedly throughout the book. Like, it goes back to the '90s when Mitt took the Olympics job and John Huntsman Sr. publicly attacked Mitt Romney kind of out of nowhere. And I write about Mitt going to see John Huntsman Sr. and kind of being like, "What's up? Like, why are you so mad at me?" And it turns out that Huntsman was trying to get John Jr. that job. He wanted John Jr. to take over the Olympics. He thought it would kind of set up his own political career. And the fact that they went with Mitt Romney kind of, irked him. And that was just one of several times over the next, 25 years in which they were just constantly running into each other, right? Um, that when Mitt ran for president in 2008, John Jr., according to Mitt, promised that he would not make an endorsement in the primaries because he was friendly with both Mitt and John McCain. And then John Jr. came out and endorsed McCain. And,
Mm-hmm.
Mitt called him and kind of chewed him out and said, your grandfather would be rolling over in his grave because their families had known each other for a long time. And it even goes up through when they both ran for president in 2012. Mitt's journals are filled with kind of like little snide comments on John Jr.'s flailing presidential campaign. Um, I think that it sometimes is the case that two people are just like thrust into a position where they're often at odds with each other, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there is also like a kind of like Mormon royalty like thing going on there. Like the Romneys and Huntsmans are two big names in Latter-day Saint political history, right? And they just don't seem to care for each other. I will say I was surprised because I had always heard that they didn't like each other that much, and you could
Right.
sort of see it, right? Like, but I never knew for sure. And then reading his journals and like it became very apparent very quickly, like, oh yeah, they really don't like each other.
We've only got a couple more minutes together, and I guess I would be curious. As you mentioned, and as Anne assesses about Mitt, he loves an emergency, he loves a crisis, and loves to do that. And not running again for Senate, he's no longer going to be the senator from the state of Utah. There's still a lot of emergencies and crises. There's
Hmm.
still a lot he can do. Do we think we're going to see him in some sort of maybe more local forum, or will we see him in a different sort of posture within the public light? Or is he saying, here, someone else take the torch? Me and Ann, we got some visiting to do. We got a home in La Jolla. We're good.
Well, so I don't know what he'll do, but I will say that the last time he tried to retire after his 2012 campaign, he was going crazy. Like his journals, he writes constantly during that period about how restless he is and how he feels like he's not getting anything done. He's useless, And so I would bet that he's not going to just kind of disappear from public life altogether. He does want to spend more time with Anne. Both of them, uh, they're in their 70s. I know they look young and healthy and vigorous, but they're concerned about their health. Anne obviously has multiple sclerosis, so they want to spend their good years together. They want to spend time with their kids and grandkids. But I would imagine he will continue to be a voice in politics. And I would be curious about if something comes up in Utah or in the church that, where Mitt Romney could be of help. I had one person float the idea to me, kind of a prominent person in Utah, that he should take over the next Utah Olympics, the next Salt Lake City Olympics.
Interesting.
um, and I mean, by the time that it happens, if Salt Lake City gets it, he would be, I think, like 80. So that might be kind of a stretch, but I mean, he could be a very helpful, person in that world. I have no inside knowledge that like Mitt is interested in that, but I thought that was an interesting idea. But I think he'll want to stay busy, so I don't think this is the last we've heard from him.
Do you think that there's any likelihood, and this is where you're perfect, being another member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to be able to speculate on something like this, that there would be a prominent point of church service that Mitt could be called to, or is he too stigmatized as a political figure that the church would be walking into something that they couldn't control?
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea. I would sometimes make jokes to him about that, like, "Hey, well, this is just in time for you to get, called as a general authority, or maybe you take over BYU or something like that."
Hmm.
And he would always kind of like laugh it off and be like, "Oh, you don't know anything about how church service works, obviously." I honestly have no idea, but I write in the book that like he was, especially after 2012, he was approached a few different times by general authorities about different projects he might be able to take on for the church. And one of them was like forming a Latter-day Saint corollary to the Anti-Defamation League, which
Hmm.
he looked into and then ultimately decided wasn't the best use of the church's resources because he thought the main threats to the church were not kind of outside misinformation, but rather like retaining, the most important things were retaining young members and dealing with our own history in a productive way. So anyway, but I could see, other kind of special projects being brought to him that he could be exceptionally well placed to deal with. I will say he is definitely very serious about the church, very serious about his faith. That comes through, I think, throughout the book. And there's a piece in Deseret magazine. Deseret News is a monthly magazine that kind of excerpts some of the faith related stories from the book that I'd urge people to check out. But it's like he definitely wants to help the church in any way he can, and so I'll be interested to see if that happens.
A question I'm sure that you've been asked a bunch of times, but if there was a thing that surprised you the most, either from his journals or visiting with him, something that you're like, whoa, I would have never seen that coming or didn't know about this at all, what would that be?
I got into it a little earlier about how hard he is on himself, and I think that was one of the shocking things to me. And in 2012, so just one example, after that tape leaked of him talking about 47% of Americans who didn't pay income tax and were never going to vote for him, this was like a big controversy in the campaign. It almost feels quaint now in retrospect, given all the crazy things that other politicians say, but this was a big deal in the campaign. And I was struck, at the time he kind of defended himself halfway and like halfway apologized and tried to move on. In his journals, he was like exceptionally hard on himself to the point where people around him actually worried that he was like clinically depressed. Like for
Mm.
weeks after, he would write about how in his journals about how he couldn't sleep and he couldn't eat, and he would ride the go on the elliptical at like a punishing pace, to try to get his mind off everything. And he would write in his journal like, I can't believe I was so stupid, how could I have done this, I've let so many people down. And actually, I report in the book that 6 weeks before the election, he called up the chief strategist of his campaign late at night and floated the idea of dropping out of the race because he
Wow.
thought that he had just blown it. And I think that that speaks to how hard he can be on himself, but also the sense of responsibility he feels. Like, in those journal entries, I haven't really talked about this that much, but I one of the most impressive things is that the conservative press kind of wrote a bunch of stories around that time saying he needs to fire all of his consultants and his campaign strategists and start over. Like, his campaign is a disaster, fire everybody, bring in new people, try to turn this thing around. And Mitt was just adamant that, like, his consultants weren't the ones to blame. His campaign staff wasn't the one to blame. In his journal, he would write, "I'm the problem, not them."
Hmm.
And I think that also speaks to kind of the loyalty he has to the people around him. And I think that that's, admirable in a lot of ways.
I have to tell you, the thing that I thought was most surprising is that he got like a special session of the temple. I thought that
Oh
was
yeah.
significant. His buddy, the temple president, was like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll do a late night session. Come on
The
in."
the Boston Temple, yeah. Ken Hutchins, I think, was the temple president back then. But yeah, basically, Mitt was running for president. He couldn't go to the temple in kind of normal hours. And so yeah, they opened up the temple for him at night so he and his family could go do a special session. And it was, I think, a really meaningful experience for him because whatever else you think of Mitt Romney, like, he did, waffle on some issues and took different positions. His faith was always non-negotiable. And there were times when consultants of his told him, like, you should distance yourself from Mormonism. Really isn't helping you politically. And he just flatly refused. That was never on the table. So yeah, I thought the temple story was, I thought, really interesting.
Yeah. Our time has expired. If people want to get the book that we've been chatting so much about, it's called Romney: A Reckoning. You can find a link to it in the show notes to be able to purchase it. McKay Coppins, we appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I'm not your editor, but I have your next project for you if you would like to
Oh, tell me
jot
right
this down,
now.
if you wouldn't mind. I think that it would be fascinating to suss out more of those Romneys in the past. And it's Romney: A Reckoning Part 2, and it goes into more about the Romney and the St. George Tabernacle and about some of those
Yeah.
people. I'm telling you, I think that there is, you approach the Romney family and say, "Hey, will you fund this?" I think there are lessons to be learned by our Romney ancestors, and
There are a lot of fascinating stories. I get into it just a little bit in the book, but his dad was born in, like, a polygamist colony in
I'm telling
Mexico.
you.
Like, there are a lot of interesting stories in the Romney family. So I'll write it down. Maybe I'll call my agent after this and see
It
what he
seems
thinks.
like a feast for someone like yourself. McKay, I hope this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you're not healthy enough to listen this week, that you'll be healthy enough to listen next week. And then when the time comes, you'll be able to travel home in safety. In the meantime, we'll be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.